Can you imagine the level of a mind that watches wrestling? Well, can you? Woody Allen obviously couldn't, perhaps feeling sorry for the sort of arse-crack, scratching, wife-beating pile of puke who'd rather watch two men grunting and groaning in a dirty ring as opposed to, say, the Seventh Seal. But then isn't wrestling a lot like the Seventh Seal, if you think about it? It's not at all unlike a game of chess where both participants know the outcome. More than that, I believe that wrestling is a metaphor not just for the struggle between good and evil, but for the struggle inside, the loss of faith, the battle within the self. I mean, didn't any of you read that into Mae Young giving birth to a severed hand? Have I taught you guys nothing? Woody Allen and wrestling. In any case, it'd be a fine Saturday night's entertainment. If I watched Annie Hall and followed it up with, say, Hart vs Austin at WrestleMania 13, I'd have a masterpiece in front of my eyes both times out. So yeah, wrestling. What can I say? I started watching at an early age, from the late Hogan years, the dark mid-90s, the glorious Attitude Era, all the way through to round about when WWE bought WCW. I kinda dropped out then and my interest has fluctuated ever since, sometimes on, sometimes off. These days I mostly just keep my eye on things, but yeah, it seems fairly okay now, what with your CM Punks and Daniel Bryans and the like. To be honest, I probably know way too much about wrestling for my own good, because my interest was big, and it started seeping into foreign wrestling, stuff from Japan that people talked about in a revered tone. You know, this wasn't your Vince McMahon soap opera shit, it was the real deal. Now, I never quite bought into that wrestling is wrestling no matter how it's sold, but hey, who cares how it's sold, because I love that stuff too. I even did some wrestling in backyards. Yes, I was young. No, there is no footage. No, I didn't do anything like this. But most of my wrestling was done in video game form. Lots of them. There was a time when I would pick up damn near every wrestling game out there, no matter how shit it was. Like I said, I know way too much for my own good. So you know what we need? Another top 10. In fact, we need 2 top 10s. Because while there's a lot of good wrestling games, there's a lot of bad ones. So, 2 lists in one video, a good one and a shit one, one in together. It's gonna be epic. Now, one little thing I should mention before we start is that this list is exclusively WWE and WCW. Why? Well, it makes things a bit simpler. Plus, that's the more showy soap opera side of wrestling, and while there's tons of great Japanese wrestling games, the licenses do get kind of sketchy, the presentation is more like a traditional sports title, and the number of games increases by a factor of 10. So I'm keeping it simple for now, perhaps another time. That said,
it's time! It's time!
The top 10 best and worst wrestling games. Go! Now, you might not have expected to see this game on the good list, I'm sure. EA did show some pretty smart business acumen to get into WCW just as the company was heading right down the shitter, and well, the game they produced, it did have some quite good parts. I do have to hand it to EA, because the presentation was really kinda something for the time, with basically all of WCW's big shows recreated. And the commentary was pretty damn good. Small point, but considering this was the norm...
This singles match will be an important match! What?
Actually having Heenan and Shivani banter in the box was appreciated. There was even some completely out there stuff in Mayhem, like entering a code that would allow you to stage the next WCW pay-per-view. I think they stopped doing that a couple of months after the launch, but it was fun all the same. So yes, WCW Mayhem did have some good ideas. It's just a shame that the actual wrestling was so damn shit. It's not exactly worth having a full roster if the majority of the characters play exactly the same. Nor is it worth having a creator wrestler that you can basically do nothing with, not to mention a match engine that was just so damn slow. Matches just seemed to plod along for an eternity. Trouble was, THQ's original WWF SmackDown was out by this point, and it was a much better and faster game than anything that had come before. Well, so long as you didn't have an N64. Mayhem had been passed by even before it was out, so while EA did have some okay ideas, they simply had no clue on how to actually make a wrestling game. And guess what? We shall revisit this some more later. I love the intro to this game. It's just so endearing to see the Mega Drive try and recreate the classic early 90s intro from Monday Night War. Now for those of you who aren't aware, this is what it's supposed to look like. But, isn't that cute? Anyway, WWF War is the last in a series of games made by Acclaim, most of which are pretty similar, but this is the best one. It's got a decent amount of wrestlers, plenty of game modes, and good graphics to boot, for the time anyway. It also has a few funny touches, like making the ref quit in frustration, not to mention the super moves you can do. Yeah, this one looks kind of awkward, sorry about that. War adheres to an old school break fingers on buttons formula, which makes it an irritating bitch and a half to play these days, but you know what? It's okay. Which isn't bad considering how shit these games started out. Now if I'm brutally honest, there isn't a great deal of difference between this and WWF War. But the roster here is tiny, there's virtually no game modes to play with, no little extras, and the game is vociferously ugly. The only real plus point here is that I believe this is the only game in the series where you could play as Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. Aside from that, it's garbage. So unmemorable, even Mr. Perfect couldn't get it right.
Super Nintendo may be a great game.
There is another main game in Acclaim's series, WWF Royal Rumble. And yeah, it's basically the same thing. I guess if I was doing a mediocre 10 list as well, it'd be number 9 on there. Off to the arcades for the next one. WWF Superstars is the precursor to WWF WrestleFest, a game which, unsurprisingly, we'll be seeing later on. It's all about tag team action. Pick two guys and go off on a quest for the tag titles, beating the biggest heels in the business at the end, the $1 Million Man and Andre the Giant. It's probably fair to say that there isn't a whole lot of point in playing this game if you can already play WrestleFest, but hey, it's still a fine game. You've got taunts, special moves, and even those little miniature wins from WrestleMania 6. The arcade was definitely the best place for some hot wrestling action at the time, especially when you consider what you could get on the consoles. Oh boy. Okay, so this is basically the first proper WWF game to be released, WrestleMania for the NES, coming out in 1989, with Rare at the helm and, LJN publishing. And yep, it's horrible. The controls are non-existent, and so are the moves. It seems as though you can virtually do nothing except strike. I think I saw a body slam once, maybe, and I certainly wasn't the guy doing it. You usually had to hammer buttons in wrestling games at this time, but this is one where you basically have to do that throughout, otherwise you'll never bloody win anything. And you even have to enter a new name after every bloody match. Just everything about this game is irritating. So yeah, not exactly a good start for WWE gaming. Up next, WWE All-Stars. The first WWE game in years that wasn't a typical SmackDown title, All-Stars instead tried to recapture the feeling of the old arcade games, a roster that mixed the current crop with legends, and lots of big moves. This is more of a fighting game than a wrestling sim. Little was expected of it, in all honesty. People had spent way too long being burned by underachieving SmackDown games to get hyped for this. However, the game is very good. It actually does manage to get a little piece of that arcade magic, and it has decent fighting game mechanics to boot. Things like juggling and combos were very well implemented in a wrestling game, with a completely different feel to most other regular everyday Joe fighting games. WWE All-Stars was the most refreshing and creative WWE game in years, and to be honest, it's a bit of a shame that it didn't get more recognition. A lot of people bemoan the fact that WrestleFest never made it home. Actually, it sort of did. WWF WrestleMania by Ocean isn't exactly a conversion of the game, but it does play a fair bit like it, and does use some similar animations. Well, about 2 frames from them anyway. Of course, the fact that it's on the shit list should clue you in that it's not exactly worth the time. First off, you can only choose from 3 wrestlers, Hogan, Warrior and the Bulldog. Everyone else in the game, mostly heels, aren't open to you. And then the action itself is, well, it's not so much WrestleFest as it is Wagglefest. And waggling any other joystick other than an arcade one is shit. And Ocean refused to have more moves than the amount of controllable wrestlers in the game. So yeah, this is awful. It's only good for either breaking joysticks or strengthening your wanking muscles. Okay, time for Acclaim to get a little bit of cred back, at least in my eyes. In the late 90s, Acclaim started creating more sim-like WWF games, starting with Wwf Warzone in 1998. The WWF was in a good place, the Attitude Era was running wild, and the game was a hit. And they followed that up next year with WWF Attitude. Now while I played the hell out of both games, this is the one I remember most fondly. Now, I won't deny that the game is kind of awful now. Moves are assigned to lengthy fighting game-esque button combos that are hard to remember, as opposed to having a standardised button scheme for every wrestler, and this makes the action flow like granite. But this game does bring back so many memories. It was the first wrestling game I had the internet for, meaning I used to go online and print off formulas for created wrestlers by the hundreds. And WWF Attitude, for the time, had an absolutely fantastic wrestler edit mode. I would fill up memory cards with wrestlers. You could have as many as 150 on one card, and then I would start simming my own federation with friends. So even if the wrestling wasn't that great, you could do so damn much with the game that, to be honest, it didn't really matter. And so for me, WWF Attitude deserves a place on the good list, because it was a great title for a wrestling nerd. Next up on the shit list, Steel Cage Challenge. Basically a Master System version of Acclaim's very boring games, only with a steel cage added. None of the 16-bit games had that. Not that I'd worry too much, because most of the matches are winnable in a few seconds or whenever you knock down the opponent. And the rest of the game? Well, it's basically the same as Super WrestleMania. The moves are the same, only there's less of them, the animations have been pared down considerably, and the game's a whole lot uglier. The only okay thing I could say about this is that the roster is sort of varied, but that's not exactly enough. Basically, utterly bland and forgettable. What's new? So yes, the series of games leading up to this one, Super WrestleMania, Royal Rumble, War, all were pretty damn average. There weren't much special about them at all. So a fresh approach was needed, and Midway would be the ones to provide it, finally returning wrestling to the arcade in the process. WrestleMania the arcade game is filled with nutty stuff. The Undertaker hits you with actual tombstones. Bam Bam Bigelow lights himself on fire. Big ham hocks fly out of Yokozuna's arse. It's certainly quite unique, and kind of sums up the strictly for the kids approach the WWF were taking around 1995. But really, the game is damn good. It's like the wrestling version of NBA Jam. If you're looking for something a bit more grounded in reality, then obviously it's not going to be for you. But for anyone else, it's a fine, fast-paced beat-em-up where people get sent flying on a regular basis. Good, clean, family fun. WWF? WCW? Bit too squeaky clean, aren't they? It's time for an extreme invasion. ECW, the third big federation in the 90s. The alternative, the one where people swore, drank beer and lit each other on fire. Now we did actually get ECW over here for a little while, and it warped my fragile little mind. All that blood, all the intense promos, you know, it was serious shit. Me and my friend's next wrestling meet in the back garden was a hell of a lot more R-rated, I can tell you that much. Anyway, ECW ended up getting a couple of games, both made by, oh boy, Acclaim. And both of them were rubbish. This is the one I played, Hardcore Revolution. Basically it uses the exact same engine and style as WWF Attitude, only with some more extreme touches added, you know, such as fire and barbed wire matches. These could have played well in a better engine, but by this time, holy shit, the Attitude engine was showing its age. It was years out of date, hopeless compared to SmackDown, or what was on the N64. And because Acclaim were completely and utterly useless, they used the same engine again for the game's sequel, Anarchy Wars. And that game wasn't well received either. This was Acclaim's last shot at making a decent wrestling game for a big company. And as usual, they blew it. As a result, I blame them personally for ECW's demise. Okay, so there was one thing that PS1 owners like me had to live with back in the late 90s. The N64's wrestling games were far, far, far better. It wasn't even a contest. We had Acclaim and the N64 had Aki. Aki were a Japanese company who basically started out making almost nothing but wrestling games. They trained for this shit. If we were including Japanese wrestling games, they'd be on here a hell of a lot more. But for now, let's look at their first major classic, 1998's WCW NWO Revenge, and we can see for ourselves why these games were just so far ahead. Firstly, brilliant control system. No ridiculous button combos, everyone has the same inputs, the action is just so much smoother as a result. The animation is brilliant, every single move is suitably bone-crunching and hard-hitting. The roster of wrestlers is huge, and every detail is there. You even get stuff like Le Parker starting matches with a chair in his hand, because that's what he did. The guys at Aki clearly loved wrestling to bits, and so they spent all their time making great games out of it. They would improve on Revenge later, but in the late 90s this game was, quite simply, unbeatable. And what did THQ give you if you were a WCW fan who had a PlayStation? They gave you this. What a bloody insult. THQ had already shut up the PS1 with the hideous WCW Nitro, but that didn't stop them ignoring the shellacking that game received and basically releasing the same game again, only under the name Thunder. Much like the actual show Thunder, this is the exact same as Nitro, only everything is just a little bit more shit. The game is just unspeakably awful. The graphics barely deserve to be called graphics, the animation is laughable, the controls make no sense, there is nothing good about this game whatsoever. And I knew this. I'd seen it received like 2 out of 10 from the official PlayStation magazine, and they used to like everything. And yet I still bought the bloody thing. What can I say? We PS1 folk were just that desperate. The only amusing thing about this game is that almost everybody has a "Pick Me" video attached to their character. No mean feat considering that the game basically features the whole WCW roster, which I think was in the thousands by this point. I like Roddy Piper's one best.
Pick me! What's wrong with you? I heard Nash. Nash said don't pick me. Fine, because I can smash Nash. Pick Hogan? Put him to sleep 3 times. Pick me. You know why? Because everybody's got to pay the piper.
Yeah, so these are quite nice, I guess. However, if there's more fun to be had watching cheap little 10-second videos than there is playing the damn game, well, you've got problems. Oh, it's true. It's damn true. And so, finally, we come to the SmackDown series. An absolute breath of fresh air when it first came out on PS1, it has since become the only game in town. Every year brings a new entry in the series, even if it's now just WWE and under the 2K banner. Some are good, some are bad, and most of the new ones disappoint all the fans who get promised a complete overhaul every year, and then every year they just don't get it. It's stale as the smell from Yokozuna's undergarments. But what's the best SmackDown? Well, that's a matter of personal preference, but I'm always going to choose Here Comes the Pain. This PS2 game from 2003 just feels right, you know, and there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, the roster. It came out at just the right time, almost a transition point. This is the only SmackDown game to feature Goldberg, it had Brock Lesnar in his pomp, WCW guys like DDP and Kevin Nash, and it's one of the last SmackDown games to feature The Rock and Steve Austin as regular superstars, as well as the first to feature the newer generation, John Cena, Randy Orton, Batista, Rey Mysterio. It's a fantastic selection, one where just about everybody is worth playing as at least once, even someone like frickin' Shauna Hare. Secondly, this is one of the last SmackDown games that really feels loose. You can still go to all the backstage areas here, and you can even do crazy things like ride a bike around or jump out of a helicopter. There's also other more technical things like chaining moves together or hitting multiple finishers. You can really just cut loose on this game. After Here Comes the Pain, THQ and Yuke seem to make the game a hell of a lot more conservative, eventually making it rather dull. HCTP, on the other end, has a very fine balance. And lastly, at its best, it's just a damn good engine for wrestling. The simulation side may not necessarily be as good as Aki's games, but it's not that far off, and it more than makes up for it with sheer spectacle. Of all the SmackDown games, this had the most pizzazz by far, and the most personality. For me, they haven't bettered this in a decade, and well, they probably never will because things are just so different now. Honestly, forget about the new ones and just go back to this, because it's better. WWF's 16-bit games weren't good, and WCW's, well, they were worse. Super Brawl is quite simply horrid, a SNES-only effort that has no good reason to exist. The only fun in it is watching the title screen and seeing all the guys randomly pop up to deliver a killer line. The action? Well, I think the grapplers have about 4 moves between them and even less frames of animation. You do see some ridiculous things from time to time, like Vader delivering insane flip pile drivers, but good lord, this is awful. In the meantime, if you were into the import racket, you could play games like Superfire Pro Wrestling X Premium, look down from your pedestal at all the pros playing this, and laugh. I mean, looking at the Acclaim games and this shit, it's little wonder that lots of serious wrestling fans went abroad for their fix. Aki's masterpiece, the game that most would regard as the greatest WWF, WWE, whatever game of them all. But it's not number 1? Holy shit, hold the front page. Make no mistake though, No Mercy is a classic. Take everything I said about the brilliant WCW NWO Revenge and multiply it by a factor of 10. It may well be a similar game, but everything is just so much better. And if Revenge lacked one thing, it was a wrestler edit system. Whereas in this game, you can freaking edit everybody. Playing it is just so much fun. I would certainly consider it the most fun wrestling game to actually play against the computer with, because it doesn't take much to just have epic contests that actually feel like matches you'd see on telly. As far as wrestling games go, this is faultless. So easy to get into, and so easy to keep playing. It's no wonder that people on the internet have done so much to keep the game up to date. Seriously, you can go online and find patches for No Mercy that'll update the roster, or even change the game entirely to represent a different wrestling company. If you're not much of a wrestling fan then, well, I can assure you, everything you have heard about No Mercy being the best wrestling game out there, and the one that it's very much okay to like, is true. And yet, it's not number 1. However, before we see what is, well, we have a shit list to finish. Believe it or not, Ocean made a sequel to the WrestleMania game they made for Brit computers that we saw a few entries back. European Rampage is almost certainly the most obscure game on both the lists. And is it an improvement? Did Ocean learn anything? Well, I think you can guess the answer. I mean, good grief, just look at it. The game features nothing except the most insipid tag team action you will find anywhere. Like the first game, you get a pitiful selection of wrestlers, 4 this time, and you can't play as any of the heel teams. But amazingly, the game's control is even more limited than WrestleMania. There are almost no moves aside from punching, kicking, and the odd slam. And amazingly, the graphics have actually gotten worse to boot. It's a freaking single screen game. European Rampage is just embarrassing. Even for a wrestling game, it's incompetent beyond belief. It came pretty damn close to taking the bottom spot, but in the end that went to a game that almost everybody can agree on. Wcw Mayhem, EA's first effort, was not a good game. However, given time, there was potential there to make something decent. However, WCW didn't have the time. By the time 2000 rolled around, the company was in freefall. WCW in 2000 is one of the worst years of any wrestling company ever. We saw things like actor David Arquette winning the WCW title, a wrestler's mother being stuck on a pole. Oh, it wasn't good. The company was close to death and everyone knew it. And Lee's final kicks and screams from WCW are perhaps summed up best by EA's second WCW game, Backstage Assault, a game that most would consider to be Lee's single worst wrestling game ever released. Why is that? Well, why don't we find out? Now honestly, I'd not played this before looking at it for the list, and strange thoughts run through your head in this kind of situation. Is it really as bad as everyone says it is? Surely not, right? And then, of course, it is. It's funny, it has more moves than some games we've seen, more wrestlers, and hell, the WCW Mayhem engine was only bad enough for number 10, but this just does things differently. For a start, the backstage part is no joke. There are no traditional match options, all you get is backstage brawl. Furthermore, it's a singles match only. Seriously, what? No teams? No 4-ways? Nothing? No, just one-on-one. And that alone makes the game stupidly limited. And to top it all off, you can only play in one arena at the start of the game. To unlock others, you have to play the bloody story mode. Let's ask Canadian wrestling legend Pat Patterson about who likes being forced to play the shitty story mode in wrestling games.
Nobody!
The matches themselves basically consist of nothing at all. You can punch, kick and grapple, or you can bash people with weapons. You can't do anything that special with them, just bend them over someone's head. It gets boring quite quickly. But really, the worst thing about this game is just how big of a rip-off it is. Remember WCW Mayhem? Well, you could go backstage in that game too. It was much the same thing as this, really. Nothing here has been upgraded from Mayhem. The moves, the wrestlers, the animations, they're all the same. So basically, if you bought this, you paid for WCW Mayhem, only with a crap load of stuff taken out of it. Holy Christ, what a fucking insult. That's what really makes this the worst wrestling game of them all. It makes every yearly SmackDown update look like the first game in the bloody series. No wonder WCW went bust just a couple of months later. So yeah, everything people said was true. Backstage Assault is the absolute drizzling shits and the worst wrestling game ever. Which at least means we can now switch gears entirely and finally see what the best is. Those days of my childhood were good. 1991, when I first started watching wrestling, when I first went to an arcade, when I first played WrestleFest. Some games may have more moves, some may be a hell of a lot more deeper, some may have lots more variety, but I've kind of always been in this for the feel and the charge of the show. And if I want a game that'll give me that, I really struggle to look past WrestleFest. Technos' sequel to Superstars was a massive improvement in every possible way. It truly was bigger, badder and better. My head would obviously put No Mercy at number 1. From a technical point of view, it's the best wrestling game ever made, at least amongst games with a license on it. But my heart goes for WrestleFest, because I've never had a single moment with it that wasn't a total riot. The cast is simple enough, a great selection of early 90s stars. You got your big guns like Hogan and Warrior, along with top heels like Ted DiBiase, Earthquake, Sergeant Slaughter and Mr. Perfect, high-level faces like Jake Roberts and Big Boss Man, and tag stars like Demolition and the Legion of Doom. Not a bad selection from the WWF's upper card. One would perhaps like to see Bret Hart, The Undertaker, and particularly Randy Savage as well, but the first two were perhaps still in the mid-card at this point, and I believe the game was released in the short time frame when Macho was retired. Anyway, all the wrestlers look fantastic. Classic examples of 2D sprite art right here. They don't have all that many moves, but what they have is animated to an absolute T and filled with personality and taunts. And everyone has their big finishers too. My favourite of all of them being Earthquake's vertical drop. Almost wants you to stick in the Monty Python theme, this does. Like Superstars, the main game mode in WrestleFest is a quest for the tag titles, currently held by the almighty Legion of Doom. The button mashing gameplay is quick enough so it doesn't become irritating, and the action can really turn so damn quickly. Although this is an arcade game, it's perfectly possible to have a decent match in WrestleFest, especially when you finally go up against LOD, who are extremely hard to put down. And tag matches aren't the only thing you can do. There's also an excellent Royal Rumble mode featuring all the game's superstars. No matter which mode you play, WrestleFest is incredibly damn fun, and it's even more fun if another person's playing along. Now, for all the advances wrestling games have made, I don't know. I just don't think any other WWF or WWE game has quite managed to capture that simple WrestleFest magic. More than just about any other arcade game, I look on WrestleFest almost as an old friend. It sounds stupid, but whenever I boot it up, I immediately just think about the good times. There may even be a little tinge of sadness when I look at the game's roster and remind myself of how many of them have passed on now. Such is the way with wrestling. That shit ain't good for the body, and the seedier sides of it can eventually turn you off. I suppose the main difference is that all the other games on this list, good or bad, are hated or loved analytically. They take me to a time when I knew all the tricks, but still enjoyed wrestling as a piece of theatre. WrestleFest takes me back to those wide-eyed days when I was 6 years old and thought everything I was watching was completely and utterly real. No other game on the list can do that, and that's why WrestleFest is my number 1.